Okay, welcome to Shit Show Earth, Minisode number 1. This mini episode is intended to be supplemental to the first episode where I talk about the 4 principles of productive public discourse. I'm going to do this episode on a case study that exemplifies these 4 principles. And I've gotten my source material from the website that is called A Starting Point. It is a bipartisan civics engagement website where people can be connected with their elected officials and get information directly from elected officials about where they stand on various issues. And one of the really helpful things that they have on A Starting Point is a section where they have a Democrat and a Republican engage in a debate, a brief debate. I mean, these don't last more than like 6 minutes. So a very brief but very structured debate about a particular issue. So I have chosen the most recent one that they've posted, and it is a debate between Representative Katie Porter from California and Representative Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. Both of these people are extremely good reasoners, and they're both very charitable in their interpretation of their opponents' views. They do an excellent job of applying the 4 principles of productive public discourse that I talked about in episode 1. So I thought that it would be great to do just a really quick mini episode to show you how these principles work in action. So let's get started. The topic that we're going to be discussing is the filibuster. Now, I want to say right up front that Shit Show Earth is not affiliated with ASP. We are simply using the resources that they've provided on their website for educational purposes. In fact, they have an educational section of their website for secondary school education. And if you're interested in looking at their website, which I highly recommend because it is extremely helpful, you can go to astartingpoint.com, or the website that they have for civics education at the high school level is homeroom.astartingpoint.com. All right, so here we go. Now, I'm going to briefly run through these principles. If you want more information about how these principles have been derived, where they come from, why am I promoting these as, the the normative standard for productive public discourse, take a look at episode 1, because I go into a little more detail and I explain a little bit more about how I arrived at these principles and why I think that they're important. So the first principle is the principle of good reasoning. Activities associated with inquiry require the use of standard logical reasoning. Now, as we go along, you'll see that I have formulated all of their debate between Porter and Johnson. I have formulated this into a logical format. So I've put it into argumentative format using the rules of logic. So at some point, I'm also going to do a mini episode on just some basics of reasoning, logical reasoning, and rules of reasoning. So you can look forward to that in the near future. Okay, so this is the most important principle, I think. A lot of these principles that follow sort of serve this first principle. So there's the principle of charity. This is also really important, though. When you're trying to figure out another person's opinion on an issue, you are required to choose the interpretation that presents their position in the most rational and truthful light possible. Again, if you want to know why these principles are the principles that I'm promoting, then watch episode 1, because I explain why they matter. The principle of generally accepted assumptions. Any assumption you use in standard logical reasoning must either be A, widely accepted by participants in the domain of inquiry, and in the case study that we're doing, the domain of inquiry is the political domain, or B, acceptable to any interlocutors for the sake of discussion. Now, an interlocutor is just a conversational partner. Sometimes I forget that I use big words, so I'll try to define any of the big words that I use. So you can, if you're having a discussion with somebody who is in the same domain of discourse, like you are both politicians and you're both discussing something that's relevant to your work, you're both already in the same domain of discourse, so your assumptions are probably going to be the same. You don't have to actually set those assumptions to begin with. But if you're talking to somebody who comes from a different domain, you might need to say, okay, for the sake of discussion, will you grant this assumption for me? Because I want to make an argument and I want to rely on this assumption. You may or may not think that this assumption is true, but if you're willing to accept it for the sake of discussion, then we can have a discussion about what follows from this. And oftentimes people will say, yeah, just for the sake of discussion, though I'm still going to not necessarily accept that as a true statement. And that's fine. You can do that. Okay? That's what makes the discussion productive. The final principle is the principle of scientifically consistent evidence. Now, again, very important principle. If you use empirical evidence in your reasoning processes, that evidence must be consistent with our best science. Now, again, I explain all of these in detail in episode 1, but let me just define empirical very quickly. Empirical evidence is just evidence that we gather through our senses. It's observational evidence. And so if you make a claim about something, you can go out and you can investigate the world to see whether or not that claim is true, then it's an empirical claim. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through this, but if you want more information about that, watch the episode because I go into more detail there. All right, now, in case there's anybody out there who's not real familiar with some of these political rules that govern the various chambers of Congress, I went ahead and I pulled up a definition of what the filibuster is. It is an informal term for any attempt to block or delay Senate action on a bill or other matter by debating at length, offering numerous procedural motions, or by any other delaying or obstructing actions. Now, the filibuster is only a rule that is in play in the Senate. Okay, so that's only one chamber of Congress. And I have a reference here for the for where I got this. And if the United States Senate, at senate.gov, they have a glossary of terms. So if you're interested in learning, if you're not familiar with some of the political terms, you can usually go there and find a really nice quick definition. All right, so I have posted the video for you. You can also go to the ASP website and look at the video directly. They have it in a couple of different formats. They have it in the format that I've posted, but they also have it in a format where you can just see each person's point in isolation from the other. So there are multiple formats, whichever one you prefer. So I've provided you with the video so that you can watch it. It might be helpful if you want to follow along with the way that I've laid this out in the debate format that I've laid it out, to go to the website and actually look at the counterpoint section where they have it broken down by each response. Okay, so Representative Porter starts, right? So, and she states right up front, she's very, very clear about exactly what it is she wants to offer as her claim. She says we should abolish the filibuster, or at the very least dramatically reform it. Now, this is going to be the conclusion of an argument, okay? Anytime you're making a claim like that in a debate, what you're doing is you're saying, here's the claim that I am then going to provide evidence in support of. So she wants, basically when she asserts this claim, she's saying this claim is true, and here is the evidence that I want to provide in support of this claim. And that is just what an argument is in the logical sense. So here's the first premise. A premise is just a statement that provides evidence for this claim, and you'll see that I've laid it out in logical format. The filibuster blocks the political function of elected officials. When blocking the political function of elected officials is institutionally sanctioned through rules like the filibuster, we undermine our democracy. Undermining democracy is wrong. Institutionally sanctioned rules that facilitate wrongdoing should either be abolished or dramatically reformed. Therefore, the filibuster should be abolished or dramatically reformed. So as you see, I have taken what she said and I have organized everything that she said into this argument format, which is just the premise conclusion format, where I have I have stated the premises in a way that they all are connected in the appropriate way with the conclusion. Okay? There are rules that govern how you structure your arguments. They have to follow certain rules in order to be valid arguments. I can go, like I said, I'll do a mini episode about that, how to do that at some later point. But for now, here's just a really good example of an argument. Now, a couple points here. When you are reconstructing an argument, you have to apply the principle of charity. If I disagreed with her, I could be very tempted to present her argument in a very uncharitable light and make it out to be something that she's not actually saying, because when you actually listen to what she's saying these things, but you have to actually put them into a much more concise format in order to create an argument like this, in this form. And so you have to be very charitable in the way that you're interpreting what people are saying. That doesn't mean that you put words in their mouth. That just means that when you're organizing your premises to support the conclusion, that you do that in a way that's logically consistent, right? Because sometimes when we're just speaking off the cuff, or we're just talking, we're making valid points. I shouldn't say valid points, but we're making good claims that support our primary claim, our conclusion. But we don't always put the words in such a way that if you wrote it down, it would be as precise as the way that I have phrased it here. Okay? But that takes skill to actually listen to what somebody's saying and then write down their argument in this format in a very precise way that is consistent with the rules of logic, but that also accurately represents what they're trying to argue. So it does take time to be able to do this, but the fact that I can do this speaks volumes about the information that Representative Porter actually provided in her opening argument. She provided all of this information. I didn't have to supplement information to make the argument work. She provided all of this. I just had to organize it into this format. So I'm not putting words in her mouth. That's not what charity requires. It doesn't require you to make things work for people if they just don't work. But this is why I'm using this particular debate as a case study, because both of these representatives do an excellent job of presenting both a claim and sufficient evidence for that claim. And so that makes putting it into argument format relatively straightforward. All right, now, here's a note. Premise 1 depends on the truth of another claim, okay? The political function of elected officials in a representative democracy, like the one that we live in, is to enact the will of the people in Congress through productive public discourse and voting on legislation. Now, I make a note of this because it's not itself a premise that supports the conclusion, but it does support premise 1. So premise 1 needs some evidence for its truth too, and this provides some evidence for that. Now, I bring this up because later in the discussion, Representative Johnson is going to sort of pick on this claim. Okay, so now here's a second note. Her conclusion has the word should in it, right? The filibuster should be abolished or dramatically reformed. Now, it's best interpreted as a moral should, right? Now, should and ought are often used interchangeably, and that's acceptable. We can do that, okay? There are some words that seem to be synonyms that we really shouldn't be using interchangeably when we're trying to be precise in our language. But should and ought are very, very, very acceptable to use interchangeably. And there are lots of different kinds of shoulds or oughts, right? So in philosophy and moral philosophy, we usually use the word ought instead of should, but they really are pretty much the same thing. So there are lots of different kinds of oughts, right? Things that we should do according to certain sets of standards or sets of rules. So there are moral rules, and then there are just your basic civil law, and then there's criminal law, right? So those are legal shoulds. You shouldn't kill someone. Well, that could be moral, but it could also be legal, right? There are rational laws or rules, not really laws, but they're rules. There are practical rules. Like if you want to be practically rational, there are certain rules that your behavior has to conform to. So these are called norms, and I talk about norms in episode 1. So if you want some more information about what norms are and how they function socially, then go and look at episode 1. But any claim that has the word ought or should in it is what we call a normative claim. It's relying on let me phrase that differently. The truth of a claim with a should or an ought in it is going to depend on the rules that are in a particular domain. So if it's a moral ought, we ought to abolish the filibuster. If that's a moral ought, that means the truth of that claim depends on what the moral rules are. If it's just a legal ought, then the truth of that claim is going to depend on what the whatever legal rules there are. Okay, so she's presenting this as a moral ought, the reason I say that is because her premise 3 says undermining democracy is wrong. Now, that requires an argument, right? It's not immediately obvious that undermining democracy is wrong. There are lots of different forms of government that have been in human history and that coexist with democracy today. So you need to make an argument for that claim, right? And the way that you would do that is you would connect it up with some moral theory, right? And there are a number of different ethical theories or moral theories that you can use. But the easiest way to do it is to make a case for the kind of harm that would likely result from a failed democracy or our failed democracy, right? So it would create a great deal of harm to people. And if you're justifying an action because you're either trying to prevent harm to people or you're trying to eliminate harm to people, that is a moral claim, right? That is, so if you say we should do whatever we can to prevent this sort of harm, the filibuster is wrong because it undermines democracy. What we're saying is this is a moral issue because of the harm involved, okay? I hope that was clear. Might not be incredibly clear, but doing my best. All right. Now, I bring this point up because the notion of harm as a moral notion is going to be consistent throughout this debate. All right, now, Representative Johnson responds with his own argument. And his claim that he wants to support is this: we should keep the filibuster. And here are the claims that he provides as evidence for the truth of this claim that we should keep the filibuster. Swings in control over Congress, which he labels inconsistency, create uncertainty for workers, families, investors, and businesses. Basically everybody. Uncertainty is bad. Now, he clearly says uncertainty is bad, right? You can watch the video, and he says that very clearly. And I put i.e. harmful here because if you look at the context of his argument, what he means by bad here is he means that it's something that causes harm to people. The filibuster helps eliminate the uncertainty that results from swings in control over Congress. Whatever helps eliminate harm to the governed should be preserved. Therefore, we should preserve the filibuster. Okay. Now, he provides additional support for premise 1. So this is a challenge when you're when you're reconstructing an argument from what somebody has just spoken. You have to sort out what claims they're making that support their premises and what claims are actually premises that support the conclusion. And that's a skill that you learn. It takes time to figure out how to do that well. But I want to flag that this is something that he provided as support for his first premise. Increasing political polarization has led to shifts in control over the chambers of Congress in 6 out of 7 of the most recent elections. And that clearly gives support for the truth of premise 1. Okay. Now, you also notice that his conclusion is also a normative claim. It contains the word should. And again, since there are lots of different kinds of normative claims, we kind of have to look at what kind of argument is he making here? Is this moral? His conclusion is we should preserve the filibuster, but notice he also made claims about harm and preventing harm. And so you could take this, you might be able to say, well, look, his conclusion could be interpreted as a practical claim, meaning that in order for people to be practically rational and successful in pursuit of their plans and ends, governance should be predictable, consistent, and evolving in ways that are foreseeable. I mean, he said that directly. Or when he stated that uncertainty is bad, right? I mean, that's a reference to harm. And so it suggests that the should in this conclusion is moral in nature, right? That we, morally speaking, should keep the filibuster because it prevents harm to the populace, right? So there's the implicit assumption that's what's morally right is defined in terms of what's good or beneficial. And this is a category of moral theories called consequentialism. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail about this. We can talk about this in a later episode of Shit Show Earth. But I just wanted to flag that. And the reason I wanted to flag that is because it's important that when two people are having productive public discourse that they're talking about the same thing. If one person brings up a moral issue, the other person should also be discussing a moral issue. They shouldn't be saying something different like, well, who cares about the moral issue? I would rather talk about, some, social, whatever, etiquette, whatever, right? The productivity of discourse depends on you not talking past one another. You need to be talking about the same thing. So Johnson has done just that very, very well, has responded with a set of claims in support of a conclusion that is also a moral conclusion. Okay. Now, this is where they're going to respond to one another's arguments. So they open up, they each lay out what their position is. Now they're going to respond to each other's positions. So Porter opens up with stating that she agrees that consistency in governance is a public good, okay? So it's important, again, to remember that when we're talking about public goods, that's always going to be, in some sense, relevant to morality. Now, then she takes issue with premise 4 of his argument. Now, here's his argument. Premise 4, whatever helps eliminate harm to the governed should be preserved. Okay, so there we have it. Now, she doesn't say that she thinks this is false. She clearly doesn't think this is false because her argument is also about eliminating harm. But what she does do is she implies or suggests that some moral reasons are weightier than others. Now, she doesn't say this explicitly, but if you listen to what she says, this is the gist of what she's arguing. Is there greater harm in the uncertainty that comes with swings in control over the chambers of Congress, or is there greater harm in undermining democracy? I mean, she clearly thinks that the institutional undermining of democracy provides an overriding moral reason to eliminate the filibuster. So here we have an interesting point about moral reasons, is that some moral reasons are weightier than others, right? And especially if you have a sort of consequentialist moral theory, you're going to have some reasons that are just overriding other reasons. Because you can have lots of moral reasons, but some of them you just can't avoid, while others kind of like, well, yeah, maybe. So what she's claiming is that the undermining of democracy is a greater moral harm, or moral wrong, not harm, but a greater moral wrong, and that is an overriding reason to get rid of it. Even if it can also eliminate some other kinds of harm, those kinds of harm are not as important. So that's the gist of what she's responding, how she's responding to Johnson's claim about the filibuster. Now, he comes back with a response to her argument. Now, he takes issue with premise 1 of her original argument, and let's look at premise 1. The filibuster blocks, the political function of elected officials. Now, he's gently chiding her. If you listen to the language that he uses, he can be very implicit in the way that he presents information. So he gently chides her for being hyperbolic. And hyperbolic just means you're exaggerating, okay? When he says facts matter, he's saying, look, you're overblowing your case here. You're exaggerating about the kind of harm that's involved here. And specifically, he thinks that she's overstating the claim that the Senate is not satisfying its political function, right? So he cites instances of bipartisan legislation that have passed under the filibuster. Okay? Now, this right here, these instances are evidence that that premise 1, her premise 1 here, is false. the filibuster blocks political function of elected officials. Well, not all the time, maybe sometimes, but certainly not all the time. So how much harm is really involved here if it only happens sometimes, right? So when he cites all of these instances, he's like, look, the filibuster doesn't block the political function of elected officials, certainly not all the time, even if it does block it. He's later going to take issue with premise 1 again. But he says that he thinks that Porter's overstating her moral case and that he disagrees that the filibuster blocks the political functions of elected officials. Right? And another thing that's clever, I mean, if you want to listen to Johnson, he's a very clever, he creates very clever arguments, and his responses are very clever. And the legislation that he cites that's bipartisan is all intended to eliminate harm to the governed. Okay, that's a sneaky move. He's like, look, here's all this other good that's being done with the filibuster. So this is a really clever response. And then he makes a supplemental argument. He says the filibuster is an important tool for passing legislation through the Senate. Good bipartisan legislation that passes through Congress is usually the Senate version of a bill, and the filibuster, therefore, right, the conclusion is the filibuster can promote the passing of good bipartisan legislation through Congress. Sorry, stumbling over my own words there. Now, he clearly states, and he does this in a really sort of amusing way, but he states that the House of Representatives is rancorous, dysfunctional, and it's a mess, right? In other words, that it's unable to perform its political function adequately. So what he's doing here is he's turning around and saying, well, it's not the filibuster that's preventing Congress from performing their political function. It's this extreme polarization that is doing it, right? That's the culprit, right? It's the extreme polarization that makes Congress dysfunctional. He says that legislation from the House of Representatives is often bad due to lack of bipartisanship, right? So these claims right here that I've just discussed are going to provide support for the premise 2 that good bipartisan legislation that passes through Congress is usually the Senate version of the bill. All right, now, Porter responds to this, and she doesn't specifically address any of the premises of that second argument. What she does, though, is she provides us reason to think that the conclusion isn't quite as good as it appears, right? So the conclusion of that argument was that the filibuster facilitates good bipartisan legislation, or the passing of legislation. And that conclusion seems to imply that the filibuster facilitates bipartisanship, right? And that's different than the passing of bipartisan legislation, okay? She says, but as it's currently formulated, though, the filibuster allows a single member of the Senate to impose their individual and probably extremely polarized opinions on the majority in an institutionally sanctioned way. Now, her evidence for this claim is the obstructionist activity and the stated intentions of Mitch McConnell as the Senate Minority Leader. She says this very clearly. She does not mince her words. In other words, the filibuster also facilitates extreme partisanship. So in some instances, even if it does facilitate bipartisanship, which his argument does not imply, right? It does not entail that the filibuster facilitates bipartisanship. But this is where she's being charitable now. Even if that's true, it also facilitates extreme partisanship, okay? So this is a really great example of being charitable to your opponent. It's like, well, it doesn't follow from your conclusion that the filibuster is good for bipartisanship. But even if it did, even if it is good for bipartisanship, it's also good for extreme partisanship. So it's a wash, is what she's trying to say. And then she finishes off her part of the debate by just returning to the premises 2 and 3 of her original argument. So that's just the idea that the filibuster is institutionally sanctioned, a type of dysfunction, and that it undermines democracy, which is wrong, right? Johnson concludes by revisiting the support that Porter provides for premise 1, her original argument. The political function of elected officials in a representative democracy is to enact the will of the people in Congress through productive public discourse and voting on legislation. Now, what he says about this is interesting. He suggests that it may be an oversimplification of the job of an elected official, this statement that she's made, that it's about productive public discourse and voting on legislation. So he says very clearly, considering the long-term consequences of legislation is more important than giving in to immediate and perhaps superficial whims of the electorate. Now, he doesn't state it exactly like that, but what he says is this, and I put it in quotes, he exactly says this: "It is not the oath of office of any elected official to listen to public opinion surveys." So my way of stating that is, we don't have to give in to the immediate, perhaps superficial whims of the electorate. Now, he makes an interesting move here. Again, he makes very interesting, subtle moves. He cites the importance of working to shape governance according to the values of the electorate rather than their opinions. Now, just an interesting note, values are a kind of mental state that is a much more stable mental state. A value is a type of mental state that you have for a very long time in your life. Your values don't fluctuate very frequently. Not really. They certainly don't fluctuate as frequently as your opinions about social or political issues. So what he's saying is like, look, people often their opinion in any given moment may not be reflective of their values. So which is it that we're supposed to be doing as elected officials? Caring about people's immediate opinion or caring about what their values are? Well, that's an interesting question. It's a little bit paternalistic, though, to suggest that people don't always know what their values are, that they don't always express their values and their opinions. But it is still a very interesting point. And this, of course, harkens back to premises 2 and 4 of his original argument. So those premises were that uncertainty is bad, right? And uncertainty can come from vacillating opinions where values are much more stable and long-term. And then 4 of his original argument is just whatever helps eliminate harm to the governed should be preserved. So he thinks that we should still preserve the filibuster because it allows for creating sort of stability where we're not getting legislation that keeps swinging back and forth between the polar extremes in the bipartisan system. Okay, so again, he wants to undermine Porter's premise 1 of her original argument. He's been sort of poking at that from the beginning. And he wants to bring it back around and say that rather than blocking the political function of elected officials, the filibuster enables the political function of elected officials, given this new expanded view of the role of an elected official that he's sort of talked about right here, which is to help keep people stable and focused on values rather than their immediate opinions. Now, whether or not you agree with this is a very subtle and interesting argument. Both of these people do an excellent job. I'm not saying I don't appreciate Porter's view, but one thing that I think that is true about Johnson is that he's a very subtle. Porter is just personality-wise very, very upfront and direct in the way that she presents her information. Johnson is a little bit more subtle in the way that he crafts his arguments. He's kind of sneaky. And for that reason, I find it enjoyable to sort of sort through what he's saying and to put it into, an argumentative format. And he always provides, again, like Porter does, sufficient evidence for creating a good, valid argument. So I don't agree with a lot of what he says politically, but I do always really appreciate his reasoning processes. So I want to ask you what you learned today from going through this. And I'm going to answer that for myself, is that as I have gotten onto the ASP website and listened to more of these back and forth counterpoints, especially ones involving Johnson, it has given me a lot of really, how can I put it? It's given me hope for our political system, because the people who make the news are the ones who say stupid things or who reason very badly, who make really unbelievable claims. People like Representative Johnson, who have extremely good processes of reasoning, who come up with really interesting arguments, who come at things from a very interesting perspective, one that I can appreciate. And those are the people who don't make the news because they don't make headlines. They're just doing their jobs, and they're just doing their jobs well. And so what I learned from going through this process is that there's hope for our political system. And that there are a lot of people in Congress who are rational and who are just trying to do their jobs and who are engaging in bipartisan interaction and good public discourse. They're just not the ones you see in the news. So if I can encourage you to do anything, is to be getting a little bit more involved in understanding who these people are in Congress and what it is that they're doing there. And again, ASP is a perfect, I know I'm really plugging ASP here, but it's just a wonderful resource. I'm thrilled with it because it makes my job a lot easier, because it gives me perfect examples of arguments that I can just analyze and discuss without having to actually come up with something on my own. They're doing the work for me. So that's what I learned. I hope that you also learned something today. I didn't ask you, notice, I did not ask you who you agree with or who you think has the better argument, because that's kind of irrelevant. What's relevant is that you can look at the inner workings of what these people believe and what they take their jobs to be, and you can learn something about them, about why it is that they're doing what they're doing. And that, I think, is really interesting. I think that you can learn a lot by just listening to what people have to say, how they're crafting their arguments, and I think it gives you greater respect for the role that our political officials are satisfying in our government. I think that we get a very unrealistic and watered down view of what it is they're doing from social media and from, sensationalist news. So that's what I learned today, and I hope that you learned something too from just looking at this and going through it with me. All right, so until next time, may your ship be sorted and organized.